Starting at the far end, away from me, David Montgomery, who's a professor here in Earth and Space Sciences. I'm going to keep these introductions very short because they'll have a chance to get into their fields and areas of passion and expertise in just a few moments. But David is a professor here and is also an author of course, published works in journals and also popular publishing with respect to increasingly common and important textbooks on dirt to soil, you could say. Julie Johnson, sitting in the middle, is a professor here in landscape architecture, and I met Julie when she was doing a design studio on climate-changed urban agriculture, which she runs amongst many other courses. And then closest to me is Jolimar Rivera Vasquez, who's the food and farms coordinator at EcoTrust, and much of her work focuses on EcoTrust's Ag of the Middle program, which she's going to share with us today. So please join me in warmly welcoming our speakers. Thank you. And I'll invite Dave up to get us started, if that's okay. Great. And you can just progress. Here we go.
Oh, okay. Do I need to use, can I just talk loud or do I need to use this? Talk loud, we're good? Okay, that's always better. My name's Dave. I'm a geologist. I'm kind of an unusual person to maybe thinking and writing about agriculture, but I've studied soil and soil erosion as a natural process for the last several decades. And I came to see sort of a backstory that I've worked up into these 3 books that I call the Dirt Trilogy. If you're really interested in this stuff, I'm teaching a seminar on this in the spring called Enviro 497, where I actually read all 3 books. Dirt basically looks at the way soil erosion undermined ancient civilization. The Hidden Half of Nature looks at why soil life, microbes, fungi, bacteria, worms, and so forth, are critical for sustaining soil fertility, how that all works. And Growing a Revolution is how that all works in agriculture. And where's your advancing thing?
On your, down here.
Oh, you've got it set up for this. All right, well, that's easy. But basically, we've spent the last 10,000 years turning fertile land into degraded land. This is the backstory of agriculture around the world in almost all circumstances. There's a few civilizations that have actually built healthy, fertile soil. Most have actually eroded it away, turning fertile land into degraded land. This is an example of soil change from North Carolina. The slide on the right is a soil from a 100-year farmed conventionally tobacco plantation. The slide on the left is the same soil, same underlying geology from the same climate. The only difference is that the land has been treated differently by farmers for the last 100 years. You notice there's a slight color difference. One is khaki, one is sort of chocolatey brown. That difference is organic matter. That's 50% carbon. When you hear soil organic matter, half of it is carbon. It's the fuel that drives nutrient cycling, that drives microbial life in the soil. This is very typical for what's happened on agricultural fields in the developed world around the world. We've lost about 50%, about half of our soil organic matter. This is of concern to a geologist like myself. How many of you had coffee this morning? This is coffee country in Costa Rica, sort of the heart of Central American coffee country. The slide on the right is what you see on most conventional coffee plantations. You notice that a reddish color goes right to the surface. If you go to the native jungle on the same hillside at the top of the hill that has never been farmed, what you see is the soil on the left. My notebook there, look above it. There's a foot of rich black soil. It's gone from the coffee plantation in less than 100 years of farming. This is actually the complete loss of the topsoil. Same thing happened from Virginia down to North Carolina on the eastern seaboard of the United States and impacted colonial agriculture in the run-up to the Civil War, but that's a longer story than I have for today. Now, those are 2 good examples of the loss of soil organic matter and the loss of the soil itself off of the landscape, but this can be turned around. It can be utterly reversed. This shows you the soil in my yard that my wife, a gardener and biologist, converted from that stuff on the left in my right hand on the screen to the stuff on the right in less than 10 years, going from 1% organic matter to about 10% organic matter. The problem of soil degradation can be reversed. It's not irreversible. And it can be reversed at large scale on farms. This is an example of 2 soils from farms in Ohio, where the one on the right, that khaki looking one, that kind of looks like the before picture from my yard and the after picture from that tobacco field, that is what this farmer that I have worked with for a while had back in 1971 when he started adopting regenerative farming practices. The soil on the left is the same field 30 years later after regenerative practices have been applied. He turned his degraded dead soil back into healthy, fertile soil. This is basically what somebody like me looks at when they think about the regenerative agriculture and its promise. What can it do by restoring healthy soils? Farmers can make more money. You spend less on inputs, less on chemicals, but harvest as much. That's a better profit margin. This is why I became an optimist on this issue. It actually works economically. The second line, comparable yields, it's not a question of being environmentally friendly or starving. These conservation agricultural practices I talk and teach about actually work to grow as much food, but they do it with less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel. They also, as you saw from those color changes that I was just running through, you can put carbon back in the soil. There's a lot of arguments about how much carbon can be put back into the soil with farming practices, but even on the low end, it's a good down payment on getting carbon out of the atmosphere. It also causes less offsite pollution. In other words, we can actually turn that degraded land back into healthy, fertile land. That's my lens on regenerative agriculture. When I think regenerative agriculture, it's the processes that can go from the left to the right on this slide. If it doesn't do that, it's not regenerative. And if you're really interested in this, on my perspective on it, take the seminar in the spring. It's limited to 20 people, so it'll be lots of good discussions.
All right. Okay, I think I need this. I don't speak very loud. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yes, maybe. Okay. Well, my name is Jolmar. I work for EcoTrust, which is an environmental nonprofit based out of Portland. However, we work from Alaska to Northern California, which allows me to work here where I live. I work specifically in the food, farms, and fisheries team. And so within that team, most of my job is supporting the Agriculture of the Middle, or Ag of the Middle program. And a big chunk of that program is this accelerator program, which is 2 years. We recruit farmers, ranchers, and fishing operations within our region that are independent, mid-sized farms, and we provide capacity building. It's a business development program. And so how do we decide to get to work with this medium-sized folks that are farming? Well, we did a lot of research. A lot of it was through the Cascades region. A lot of it, a good chunk of it actually, is 2 reports were from Oregon, because that's where where EcoTrust is, it's in Portland. And when I came in about 2 years ago, we also did the Puget Sound Food Infrastructure Report. And so with this in the background, we were able to put together this Ag of the Middle framework. And I would say this is not like a set in stone. It's more of a guidance to kind of figure out what agriculture of the middle is, because middle, it's kind of a blurry term. But what you will see is Ag of the Middle is in the blue in the middle, pun not intended. And they're basically farmers that are bigger than the traditional small farmer that sells to the eaters, basically. So if you, for an example, would be a farmer that sells at a farmer's market. And so maybe they only sell at a local scale, like a city or maybe their county, but not much beyond that. On the other side is commodity industrialized large-scale farms that are selling to globalized markets or national markets. Ag of the Middle folks are in the middle. So they may do a little bit of this direct interaction on selling to eaters, but most of their volumes are going to be wholesale. And so that means that they're selling to institutions like colleges, like UW, or retailers, grocery stores, restaurants, school districts, and so on. And so that allows them to work at a regional scale, more local. So they can still work with cities and counties, but maybe it's 2 or 3 counties, maybe it's all Puget Sound, maybe it's the West Coast, maybe it's even the state, sometimes maybe adjacent states. But the idea is that these folks are not in the globalized commodity markets. And so supply chains are much shorter. And these are typically family-owned operations. So with these folks, again, local values, wholesome levels, a lot of them are already practicing regenerative principles and providing social benefits to their communities. So this is what producers in our program look like. We have 44 businesses. Combined, they have 10 million plus in revenue. They manage approximately just over 18,000 acres. That's the amount of jobs that combined have created. And I like this because these are usually folks that have been underrepresented in farming communities. And so combined women-owned businesses, we have a few people of color and I believe one person in the LGBTQ plus community, and combined that's 70% of our participants. This is an infographic that our team was kind of established after all the research that we did, and it kind of matches the supply chain, basically. So that's agriculture of the middle, with the producers growing and their produce and livestock, or fish, because we also include fishery operations. And the end goal is to get the food to the institutions, right, at the wholesale level. But there's things that happen in between, which is food infrastructure needed, like aggregation. How do we collect all this produce and livestock products and aggregate it in one place? How do we package it and process it? And then how do we get it out to the institutions or sometimes the eaters as well? And so the bottom line I drew separately because we didn't take food equity into account when we first came up with this infographic. And usually that's a mistake. So as we move forward in our programming, we're trying to consider how do we provide food access to healthy, nutritious food, and embed that, especially within the context of climate change, in every single part of these. So this is an infographic from actually GRAIN, but I took it from the Climate Justice Alliance, on food sovereignty steps that folks and organizations can focus on for moving for resiliency in climate change. So take a moment so you can look at it. And that's my contact info.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Johnson, and I teach in landscape architecture. How many people have ever been in Gould Hall? Fair number of you. If you ever go up on the 3rd floor, you'll see a fair number of drawings and models and other works that landscape architecture students are engaged in designing future, better, more resilient places in our communities, in our cities. And my concern as I look ahead to your future, and why I'm so happy to see so many of you here, is that climate change is going to change so much of how we get our food, where we find our food, and how we live. It's also going to affect where we get the water to grow our food, or don't, and what that climate is going to afford us to grow. So as we look at that, some of my teaching has really begun to explore kind of where and how can we grow food in our city that isn't the most common places to find food. So I'll try and take you on a quick field trip. Has anyone been here? Perry has, a couple other people. This is the Beacon Food Forest. This is an abundant urban agriculture site where there are community gardens grown by individual community members, as well as this larger garden space that you see on the bottom where it says harvest here. And it's grown using a food forest approach of not just cultivating everything in rows, not just having one monocrop, but having multiple crops, having them support each other through an ecological system, being able to grow fruit and nuts and other things. I'm not sure if they have nut trees, but perhaps they do. We'll have to go and check. And to work that together. This happens to be grown in a utility corridor line in Beacon Hill. Here's your public utility corridor at work. Please go visit it. While you're in South Seattle, you can also visit Bradner Gardens Park. This was a former school site that became a pea patch garden to support immigrant farmers, and then later grew into this multifunctional park that brings people together for many different reasons. This artwork was created by young students to create a bench that provides a fence that separates a basketball court from pea patches. There's places to hang out for people, so it's a community gathering space. There's a covered pagoda or pavilion that was built by a UW design build studio. And there's a building there that harvests energy from the sun with solar panels, harvests water from the roof, and brings that into this cistern so that the water can be reused. These are all strategies that I hope will become much more commonplace in your future for a more resilient future. There's a children's garden, and just down the hill is a preschool whose children come up here regularly to play in this garden, to gather this food, and they know what they're eating. They know their food. If we move to a different part of Seattle and go to the International District, Chinatown International District, we'll find Danny Wu Community Garden. Has anybody been there? A couple more hands. What do you notice there when you first go there? There's a large variety of food being grown there. Yeah. Perry, what stands out for you for this community garden?
There's food that I'm unfamiliar with.
Uh-huh.
That is not, it's of a different culture than I grew up with.
Yeah.
So a large diversity.
Very diverse, very different, coming from different cultures. And this garden is tended by elderly Asian people who live in the International District, in Chinatown International District, and come and garden here on a regular basis. This is where they grow their food that's culturally relevant, that may not necessarily be available in grocery stores. This garden also has a children's garden now. There's more intergenerational garden being learned. And up on the next terrace up, you see kind of a structure that's holding chickens. So here's a community garden that's not only growing crops, but is having chickens as part of their system. And last but not least, does anybody recognize this site? Okay, there should be more hands. No? Oh, now we're talking. Okay. Mercer Court. Mercer Court is an urban farm. This is part of the UW farm system. And if you haven't been here, you should go here. If you haven't grown food here, you should come and talk to Perry, who happens to be sitting in the audience and is the coordinator for the UW farm. This is an awesome way to make use of land that otherwise would be pretty marginal, right? There's not a lot that happens in this space between the buildings. It'd be better if we could think about growing it in other places that are a little bit sunnier as well, some of those lower levels. But we need to start thinking more creatively about where and how can we change where we grow? How do we change regulations so that instead of having fruit trees be illegal to grow in the space between the street and the sidewalk, they can actually be encouraged, and people can help to grow their food in their local environment and care for that and reduce the food miles that we hear about to help support food security, to help support culturally relevant foods, and perhaps most importantly, to really bring people together. If you read the Eastie Farm article about Boston, you know how that group is really looking at resilience, looking at climate resilience through the lens of growing food together. Thank you.
This is actually.
All right. Thank you all so much for that. Actually, Julie, I'll keep that close to you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the introductions.
might fall under this umbrella of regenerative agriculture, but that you would consider to be supporting climate-friendly agriculture. Let's say maybe there's a better term and you can correct me. So the scale, whereabouts, and what specific practices you're seeing as successful options for our future. And David, I can start with you.
Sure. I'll just talk loud again, if I may. And I've been working at scales from 20,000 acre farms in the Dakotas to small subsistence farms in Africa, for which 2 farms would fit into this room. And I've worked on, I think, every continent except Antarctica, which doesn't have much farming. But I'm a geologist, so most of what I do around the world is not farming related. But I've looked at soil erosion and degradation. The simple recipe to reverse that, which is the key to regenerative agriculture, is to don't disturb the soil, keep it covered with living plants, and grow a diversity of things. No-till, cover crops, and diverse crop rotations. That works, and it works for a very simple reason. That's a recipe for cultivating beneficial life in the soil. And that is the key to reducing the need for fertilizer. Going no-till is the key for reducing the use of diesel. Growing a diversity of plants is a key for reducing the use of pesticides. These are all linked together. If you do only one of those 3, like just go no-till, it doesn't necessarily work for what you're trying to do if you're interested in restoring fertility to the land. It's the combination of all 3 that really works. And the thing that was most surprising to me about that was the time scale over which it can work. It can start to produce results within a year or 2, and over the course of 2 or 3 decades, refill the reservoir of carbon in the soil. There's a limit to how much carbon you can put in the soil. You can't just keep stuffing it in there. But we've drawn down the levels so much, there's a big opportunity for doing it in places all around the world. And I don't know if I forgot one of your points.
See if I can remember all this. My work tends to focus in the Seattle metropolitan area. The studio that you came to this fall was exploring urban agriculture systems from kind of central Seattle out to Woodinville. And many of these different places that we have for urban ag are these places that you can also learn how to grow sustainably. So more field trips, right? 21 acres in Woodinville would be an awesome place for you to visit. Viva Farms is right next door, and maybe you'll talk a little bit more about that. So I think ultimately that kind of scale of what can we grow locally, how can we be involved on a regular basis in growing our own food, and what does that mean for ecological systems? I think your point of diversity also calls to attention our need for helping to provide habitat for different species, particularly pollinators that are threatened. And as we look at climate change, those opportunities to say, how do we create a more ecologically diverse urban environment is not only important for habitat for pollinators, but for ourselves as well. Yeah.
So, like I said, I work at the agriculture of the middle scale. I kind of showed you the framework. Local, regional, wholesale value volumes. If you're wondering in terms of acreage, most are going to be either very small, diversified farms like 1 to 10 acres. A lot of them, majority of them are going to be between 10 to 100 plus, but we also have some up to 2,000 acres. In terms of the practices, everything that Dave said. But I will also add, because a lot of our producers are livestock producers, silvopasture and just the whole concept about grazing rotation. It's certainly something that our producers do a lot. As Ecotrust moves into continuing to further food equity and food justice, we're hoping to work with more urban farmers, small farmers, Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers, and communities that are probably already doing that in a sense of community gardens or looking for space to do this kind of stuff. Julie mentioned Viva Farms, and they have a farm in Burlington and in Woodinville, and at least the one in Burlington is highly diverse in terms of its people. A lot of them are Spanish-speaking Latinx folks, and so we're actually hoping to
actually where my background as a geologist comes into play, because if you look back at what happened to agriculture in, say, the classical Greece or the Roman Empire, they destroyed their land, and they didn't have Monsanto. They didn't have agrochemicals. They did it with organic practices. And the villain in that tale that I told in the dirt book, it was the plow. When you till the land, when you plow the land up, you're inverting the soil. What that does is it leaves the land surface broken up and not covered by plants. Nature clothes herself in plants. It's how you build soils and keep the land colonized and nutrient cycling. If you have the land bare and vulnerable to erosion, you can literally strip the soil off. That's what happened in that slide of the coffee plantation in Costa Rica. They left the soil bare for 100 years in between their coffee plants, and next thing you know, geologically thinking, the soil's gone. But it happens slow enough you don't notice it year to year. You notice it generation to generation. And if you look at some of the most impoverished places in the world today that were wealthy in Roman times, you're looking at Syria and Libya. Places where there used to be healthy, rich soils, and they were eroded off several thousand years ago. The lasting effect can be quite long. So when you look at no-till farming, it's kind of the down payment to building healthy soils, keeping the soil on the land in the first place. And that's what no-till gets you. And what no-till is as a method, is instead of plowing, you use something like a little disc that will carve a trench behind your tractor about as wide as my pinky finger, and you have specialized equipment that drops seeds down into that trench and then covers it back up. It allows you to plant through the crop stubble from last year's crop. So you can keep the ground covered, and it's not very disturbed. I've walked behind a no-till planter, watched it go, and I could barely tell the ground is disturbed. You walk behind a plow that inverts the soil, you get a whole different perspective on it. So no-till is sort of the foundation for regenerative agriculture, but if you look at the adoption of no-till in the last 50 years or so, what allowed it to proceed and be widely adopted was the invention of the herbicide glyphosate and glyphosate-resistant crops. Now, why is that? Because weed control is why people plowed historically to begin with. Tilling is a really good way to eliminate weeds. You kill them and turn them upside down. It's a great way to kill a plant. Glyphosate is another great way to kill a plant. It's also a great way to kill your microbiome, but that's a whole different deal if you eat it. Which makes a question of, should we be spraying it on food? That's a whole other question. But the ability to have simple weed control with patented seeds you would buy from a company that would also sell you the herbicide that would kill every other plant that might grow among your plants, that was like the easy button for weed control. It allowed no-till farming to really take off in the Western world. But as I go through in some detail in Growing Revolution, there's other ways to do weed control than herbicides. And that's where we need to sort of move in regenerative farming, is to take the no-till foundation and become more ecologically minded in how we're managing weeds. And many of the really progressive and innovative farmers that I've interviewed have figured out ways to get off of herbicides or to so reduce their herbicide use. I tease them that they're organic-ish farmers because they're not really using much in the way of herbicides anymore.
Thank you. And so just to carry forward that idea of becoming more ecologically minded and taking a systems approach, Julie, I'll ask you if you can speak a little bit about silvopasture and the role of animals in bringing fertility back into systems, especially ones that have been denuded over time.
Well, my background is not in food and farming, so I'm not an expert in the area, and maybe David can share more, but we definitely have folks practicing this in Washington, in Whatcom County we have a couple of farmers basically using the interaction of having the livestock with trees, sometimes they have orchards, as well as perennials and a diverse amount of plants and different kinds of plants. So doing that agroecology, having that mindset and putting it into practice where you're trying to mimic a little bit of what the natural environment would look like is basically what some of our producers do.
Thank you. That's excellent. And to follow along with that, next week we'll actually have a couple of livestock farmers coming in and talking about closing the nutrient loop in that way as well. So we'll pick up on those thoughts. Thank you so much. And Julie, I'm going to turn
So I think that the different readings that came to light, the Civil Eats article that talked about Eastie Farm really played out that story well from a grassroots initiative of someone seeing this kind of lost piece of land and beginning to organize to take that over and grow food and grow community in that process. There are so many great examples in Seattle, and this is one reason why from a design perspective, and I think really from a kind of envisioning our future perspective, how those stories come to light to learn about. Bradner Gardens Farm is a great example. It was one of the case studies from our book, Greening Cities, Growing Communities, where we looked at kind of the transition of this piece of land that was actually threatened for development. It had been a pea patch. The city was looking at it to sell that land off for private development, and community organized to save that. It was so valued both for the purposes that it had as growing food, but also as a community center, basically, a place that brought people together, that they were able to successfully preserve that land and then also get a grant to have a landscape architect work with them on how to redesign it. It's also a great case study in terms of partnerships. There were multiple organizations and groups that came together, built this coalition to transform that site into what it is today and how it brings many different people here today. In our design studios, different studios address different kinds of projects. Some are very grounded in community, and indeed design build studios do that sort of work where they're working with a community and actually then building something the following quarter. I'm not involved in those myself. The studios that I've been involved in tend to work with community groups to begin to explore what's needed, how might that change, what kinds of opportunities might our students begin to envision for improving or expanding or changing what their current sites have to offer. This past fall, we were looking to work with the UW Farm at Mercer Court, and two students working on that project were looking at opportunities to improve areas that are already kind of challenging for growing food. Also thinking about places where there can be better storage, which was a much more practical consideration, but if you can't take care of the day-to-day maintenance of those places, they're not going to thrive and provide the benefits of growing food as they are. Another site was the Nathan Hale High School Urban Farm. This is a site that is engaging high school students in urban horticulture and being able to grow a lot of different foods and practices on their site to continue to experiment how that might work, but actually to look then at a hillside as an opportunity for long-term change. How do we envision what's currently just a grassy slope into something that could be productive and bring people together? So I think maybe I'll pause there.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I'll just pick up on that to ask the whole panel, if you have other ideas of ways to share the resources of regenerative agriculture, share the knowledge that we already have about it, and also incentivize some of these practices. And maybe that, you started to touch on it at the urban scale, or where there's kind of a community-based coalition that's moving in that direction, or where there's a shared interest in that. But how do we work with farmers, encourage farmers, incentivize farmers in different ways to take on this, essentially transformation of the way farming is done? Billy Martin, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, first, kind of connecting to Julie's, what she mentioned, there's also a lot of communities that have traditionally been involved in the food system, like African American, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous. I mean, we're in close to sea land, that have historically been not involved in conversations about how do we rebuild the food system. As we know, it's heavily industrialized and we have these long supply chains, and not everybody has access to healthy, nutritious food. Whether it's because they don't have a grocery store nearby, or whether it's because they can't afford going to Whole Foods, even if not necessarily that's local, but people assume that those are. So that's something that you should all consider as you careers in the food system, it's definitely involving those communities that have traditionally been heavily involved but haven't had an opportunity to have a say. And, you know, Seattle is a heavily, has a history of redlining, which, you know, has put food apartheids in place and limit people's access to, you know, the simple fact of a grocery store that actually has produce, like good produce. So that's one thing. And the other thing is there is currently a Sustainable Farms and Fields bill in the Senate. I believe it passed the Senate and it had a public hearing at the House in the beginning of February, and it's called, I wrote it down, Senate Bill 5947. It's sponsored by Carbon Washington, which is an organization here, and it's basically what Yona is saying. It's to provide, it's a grant program to provide incentives for farmers to adopt some of these regenerative practices. So I'm very curious to see where it goes, because I particularly don't know of any other legislation, especially in Washington, but nearby, of something that will promote these practices at a state level, or hopefully in the future others will also jump into that.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to incentivize farmers to adopt regenerative practices is to point out that they can slash their fertilizer bill. They can save money. It works. It's a good incentive. I first started talking to farmers in the Midwest about sequestering carbon for their climate. Didn't get very far. Same things you would do to reduce your fertilizer bill are what you do to put carbon in the ground. So it's how you frame the discussion has a huge impact on how you're received. If we could actually pay farmers carbon credits for putting carbon in the ground, it would be transformative if we valued it high enough. The other thing that I think would be transformative is growing consumer awareness of the actual nutritional differences and the qualities of the food that's grown conventionally versus grown regeneratively. That's the book that my wife and I are working on now. It will probably be called You Are What Your Food Ate, because you are.
All right, and we just have a couple of minutes left, and I'm just wondering, in a statement or two, could you share your vision for the ideal agricultural scenario for the Pacific Northwest? No pressure. What should we do here?
The first thing is support the farmers locally who are adopting these regenerative practices. Whether you're a meat eater or a vegetarian, there are good farmers in the region doing incredible jobs fixing their land. The problem is if you go into a grocery store, the only label you have is conventional versus organic, and that's not enough to actually tell the difference between regenerative farmers and horrendously conventional farmers. So, you know, the first step I would say is, try and educate yourself about where your food's coming from, whether it's in the dorms and the relationship to the university farms, influence where they're getting stuff. I'm actually depressed every time I go into the hub and look at the food choices you guys have. You could change that if you made enough noise about it.
I think from my vision of that future would also be to say, how can we stop building on farmland in our environment? We have huge growth happening in our region, and yet if we cover our farmland with buildings, we've lost that fertile soil and that capacity to grow food. So to continue to develop in smart ways to continue to grow the food that we can locally is really important. The other is to continue to push on and explore where and how we can grow food in places that aren't so expected. How could we be having blueberry bushes growing out around Drumheller Fountain instead of other evergreen bushes that aren't doing a whole lot other than creating a wall for us? So keep pushing on where and how we can change our food paradigm.
I'll echo everything that they said, but just to mention again, definitely involving communities and having a say to redesign, rebuild their food systems. I will say it again, the shortening of supply chains, supporting your local farmers. You can also support Washington state farmers, that regional scale, rather than having to ship from garden or maybe you don't have experience growing your own food, but you have a farm on site. So I highly encourage you to, get dirty and put your hands in